the moment my daughter stood up at the front of the community hall, tapping that silver microphone until it gave a sharp, high-pitched squeal that echoed off the cinder block walls, the entire room went deadly quiet. She looked at me, her dark eyes shining with something that wasn't joy. It was more like a heavy burden she was about to set down. She said, "Daddy, before anything else, there's something you need to know." My smile, which had been plastered on my face for 3 long hours of handshakes, backslaps, and grocery store sheet cake, dropped before I could even tell my muscles to hold it in place. Folks were still clapping a little, the sound dying down unevenly like popcorn finishing in a microwave. But I felt a heaviness settle right in the center of my chest. It felt like I had swallowed a lug nut, sitting heavy, cold, and jagged in my gut. My name is Carlton Hayes. I'm 72 years old, born and raised right here in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where the pine trees are tall enough to scratch the sky and the summer humidity is thick enough to chew on. I spent 50 long, hard years working as a long-haul truck mechanic, keeping 18-wheelers moving across this country while I stayed put in the same zip code. I know diesel engines better than I know the back of my own hand. I know how to fix things that are broken, how to listen to a hum and find the rattle, how to grease a fitting so it runs smooth. But that night, sitting in my Sunday best navy suit that felt a little too tight around the shoulders, I was about to find out that some things can't be fixed with a wrench or a prayer. Before I go on with this story, I want to ask a small favor from you. It gets mighty lonely telling these stories into the quiet of an empty room, so if you're listening, please leave a little like for this old man. It reminds me that somebody out there still hears my voice, that I'm not just talking to the dust motes floating in the air. And if you have a moment, tell me where you're watching from in the comments and what time it is there. It keeps me company to know what corner of the world you're in while I sit here on my porch watching the sun go down. Anyway, let me take you back to the moment everything started to crack. I had just walked into the community hall about an hour before the speech began, and the air was thick, smelling heavily of fried chicken, vinegar-based coleslaw, and sweet tea so sugary it could rot your teeth on contact. It was the kind of smell that usually makes a man feel at peace, grounded in his community and his people. My coworkers were there, men I'd spent decades with, their hands permanently stained with grease that never fully scrubs out, no matter how much orange soap you use. They were hugging me, slapping my back and shaking my hand until my arm felt loose in the socket. "You made it, Carlton," they shouted over the Motown music playing on the speakers. "You finally crossing the finish line, old-timer." I was shaking hands, feeling proud, feeling seen. But then I caught sight of my daughter, Lorraine. She was standing near the punch bowl, wearing a yellow dress that usually made her look like sunshine, but today she looked like a storm cloud brewing over the Gulf. She was smiling, but it was a tight, thin thing, like she was holding something sour behind her teeth. My wife, Denise, was sitting at the main table, looking like she wanted to shrink down and disappear under the tablecloth. She kept adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses, pushing them up her nose, then pulling them down, over and over again, a nervous tic she hadn't had since we were newlyweds back in the 70s. She wasn't looking at the guests, or the streamers, or the big vinyl banner that said, "Happy Retirement, Carlton." She was watching Lorraine. She was watching our daughter with the kind of terrified look a deer gives a hunter when a twig snaps in the quiet woods. It was fear, pure, unadulterated nervousness radiating off her in waves. Right then, before any revelations or microphones, something felt off in the air. You know how the Mississippi sky turns a peculiar bruised shade of green right before a tornado touches down? That's what the atmosphere felt like in that hall. It was heavy. It was charged with static electricity. I tried to tell myself I was just imagining things, that maybe the nerves of retiring were finally getting to me. I pushed the feeling down deep, buried it under the noise and the laughter, but my spirit was already sounding an alarm I refused to hear.
For decades, my routine had been as simple, reliable, and sturdy as a cast-iron skillet. I would wake up before the sun, usually around 4:30 in the morning, while the house was still blue with sleep and the floorboards were cold under my bare feet. I'd make my coffee, strong and black, pouring it into the same battered steel thermos I'd had since the early 90s, the one with the dent on the side from where I dropped it off a lift. Then I'd drive my old Ford truck down the highway to the shop, the tires humming against the asphalt, and spend the next 10 or 12 hours getting other folks' engines back to life. I lived my life under the hood of Peterbilts and Kenworths, breathing in diesel fumes and oil until they felt like part of my lungs. I didn't make a fortune, not by any stretch of the imagination, but I made an honest living. I paid for our brick house on Cedar Street, every single mortgage payment on time. I put hot food on the table every single night, meat, potatoes, greens. I built a quiet, steady home with the woman I loved more than breath itself. Denise was my rock, or at least I thought she was. We had built the life that made sense. It was sturdy. It was predictable. It was ours. As retirement got closer, folks kept asking me, "Carlton, what are you going to do with all that free time? You going to fish down at the creek? You going to travel to see the Grand Canyon?" I'd laugh and say, "I'm going to rest." But the truth is, I was scared. I was terrified of the stillness. When you spend a life in constant motion, stopping feels a lot like dying. I was worried about who I was if I wasn't fixing something. I was worried about being home all day, disrupting Denise's routine, getting in her way in the kitchen. I thought that was the biggest problem I had to face, learning how to be a retired man without a job to define him. I had no idea that the foundation of my house was rotting out from underneath me while I was busy worrying about the paint on the walls. Denise had always been the steady one in our marriage, the calm water to my fire. When I was working double shifts or getting called out to fix a rig on the interstate at 2 in the morning in the pouring rain, she was the one holding down the fort. She was the bridge between me and our daughter Lorraine, smoothing over the rough patches when my work kept me away too much. She was the gentle voice that kept our family from drifting apart, reminding me of birthdays and anniversaries. But over the past year, something had shifted in her. It was subtle at first, like a hairline fracture in an engine block. You don't see it until the pressure builds and the steam starts escaping. She had been distant. Not cold exactly, but far away, like she was tuning into a radio station only she could hear. I'd catch her staring out the kitchen window at the bird feeder, but her eyes weren't seeing the cardinals. They were looking at something inside her own head, something that scared her. She started hiding her phone, flipping its screen down on the table whenever I walked into the room. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find her side of the bed empty, the sheets cold, and I'd hear her whispering on a call in the laundry room, her voice low and frantic. When I'd ask her about it the next morning, pouring her coffee, she'd brush off my questions like dust from a sleeve. "Oh, it's just church business, Carlton," or "just checking on a sick friend from the choir." But she wouldn't look me in the eye when she said it. She'd look at the toaster, the floor, her hands. I told myself it was stress. I told myself we were getting old now, and old marriages shift like old wood in a damp house. They creak, they groan. I didn't want to be the suspicious old husband asking questions, so I let it slide. I trusted her. I had 50 years of reasons to trust her, and I leaned on that history like a crutch. Lorraine, too, had been acting strange, like she was carrying a heavy backpack she couldn't take off. My girl had always been Daddy's little girl, even when she grew into a 40-year-old woman with a career at the bank and a life of her own. She had my laugh, folks used to say, a deep belly laugh that filled up a room. But lately, she had been more serious, almost somber. She was watchful around her mother, tracking Denise's movements with a critical, suspicious eye. And with me, she was colder in a way I couldn't understand, almost like she was pitying me or saying goodbye. When she walked into the party that night and hugged me, she held on tighter than usual. It wasn't a happy hug, the kind full of celebration. It was a desperate one. It felt like she was bracing for something, or maybe bracing me for a fall. She smelled like the vanilla perfume she's worn since high school, but underneath that, I could smell the sharp tang of sweat. She was nervous. Her hands were trembling just a tiny bit against the back of my suit jacket. "You okay, baby girl?" I had asked her, pulling back to look at her face. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes remained flat and sad, like the surface of a pond on a cloudy day. "I'm fine, Daddy," she said, but the word Daddy sounded thick in her throat, heavy with something unspoken, like a stone caught in her gullet. She looked over my shoulder at Denise, and her expression hardened into something like flint, cold and sparking. I didn't ask why. I didn't want to spoil the night. I just patted her hand and let it go. I should have asked. I should have stopped the whole party right then and there and demanded to know what was going on. But hindsight is a cruel teacher, showing you the answers only after the test is over. The party was in full swing now, a whirlwind of noise and celebration. My coworkers were joking around, handing me gag gifts, a rocking chair with a seatbelt, a giant magnifying glass for reading the newspaper, a fishing hat with beer holders. They slapped my back so hard I nearly choked on my yellow cake. "No more 4 a.m. wake-ups, old man," Vernon shouted, laughing loud enough to shake the rafters of the community hall. Everyone was laughing. The room was full of warmth and noise, the kind of celebration a man works his whole tired life to earn. Everyone was laughing, except Denise. I watched her from the corner of my eye while I unwrapped a new tackle box. She was sitting there with a slice of cake untouched on her paper plate, the frosting melting into a puddle. She was shredding a paper napkin into tiny white confetti, her fingers working fast and nervous. Every time Lorraine looked at her mother from across the room, Denise looked away. She would look at the floor, at the ceiling, at her sensible shoes, anywhere but at our daughter. It was unnatural. Those two used to be as close as two people could be. They shared clothes, shared secrets, called each other every single day at lunch. Now the air between them was so cold you could see your breath. I tried not to stare. I didn't want the guys to see me worrying on my big night. But an uneasy feeling kept rising in my chest, bubbling up like bile. It wasn't just nerves, it was instinct. It was the same instinct that tells you a tire is about to blow 3 miles before it happens, just by the vibration in the steering wheel. Something was wrong in my house. Something was coming for us, and I was the only one in the room who didn't know which direction it was coming from. Looking back now, with the clarity that only pain provides, the signs had been there for weeks, maybe even months. Back at home, things had already been drifting. Our house, usually full of the sound of the TV news or us chatting about the neighbors, had gone quiet. Conversations were shorter, clipped at the ends like we were running out of words. Dinners were quieter, just the sound of silverware scraping against china plates and the clock ticking on the wall sounding louder than a hammer. Denise kept finding reasons to go into town alone. She'd take the car and be gone for 4 or 5 hours at a time. "Just going to the market, Carlton," she'd say, grabbing her purse and clutching it tight. But when she'd come back, she'd have 2 bags of groceries that shouldn't have taken more than 40 minutes to buy. Milk, bread, maybe a can of coffee. She'd come back with a nervous smile and an excuse that didn't match the time she was gone. "Ran into Martha from the beauty shop," she'd say, or Traffic was backed up on the bypass because of construction. But she wouldn't look at me. She'd busy herself putting away cans of beans, her hands moving too fast, clattering the cans on the shelf. I wanted to ask questions. I wanted to say, "Denise, where have you really been? Why are you trembling?" But I also didn't want to hear the answers. I was afraid she was sick and hiding it. I was afraid she was unhappy and didn't know how to tell me. I was afraid of rocking the boat right before we sailed into retirement. So I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I let the silence fill up the rooms of our house until there wasn't any air left to breathe. I thought if I ignored the cracks, the wall wouldn't fall. That's the mistake of a man who thinks he can fix everything by just holding it together a little longer, hoping the rust won't eat through. About a month before the retirement party, on a Tuesday afternoon, I had come home early from the shop because of a migraine that was splitting my head open. The house was quiet when I unlocked the front door, so I walked in soft, not wanting to make noise or wake Denise if she was napping. I heard Lorraine's voice coming from the kitchen. She wasn't supposed to be there. She lived across town and worked till 5. She was on the phone, her back to me, and her voice was pitched high and tight, full of anger I rarely heard from her. "Mama, you need to tell him," she was saying, practically hissing into the receiver, holding onto that counter edge like it was a life raft in a storm. "He's going to find out one way or another, and I'm not going to be part of the lie anymore." I froze in the hallway, my hand still on the strap of my heavy lunchbox. Who was she talking to? Denise was out at the dentist, or so she said. Was she talking to Denise on the cell phone? "He's going to find out one way or another," Lorraine said, her voice cracking with emotion. "And I'm not going to be part of the lie anymore." When I walked into the kitchen, my boot squeaking on the linoleum, she spun around so fast she nearly dropped the phone. She hung up immediately, shoving the phone deep into her pocket like it was burning her leg. Her eyes were red, rimmed with tears, but her jaw was set hard as granite. "Hey, Daddy," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't hear you come in." I asked her what was wrong, who she was arguing with. She just shook her head, looking trapped. "Work trouble," she lied. I knew it was a lie. I sensed a secret hanging between her and whoever was on that phone, but neither of them would say a word to me. I started wondering whether Denise was sick. It was the only thing that made sense to my mind. She'd lost weight. Her Sunday dresses were hanging off her shoulders a little loose, the fabric bunching up, and her face looked gaunt in the mornings, the skin gray and tired. She slept less, tossing and turning beside me, kicking off the covers and then pulling them back up, mumbling in her sleep. She had a deep sadness behind her eyes that she hid badly, masking it with forced cheerfulness whenever I asked how she was feeling. She'd visit friends I'd never heard of, names like Clara from the old choir or Betty from the library board. I'd been married to this woman for 50 years. I knew everybody she knew. I knew her cousins, her second cousins, her elementary school friends. Once I was looking for a breath mint in her purse while she was in the shower, and I found a plastic hospital wristband crumpled up at the bottom, buried under receipts and tissues. It had a date from 3 days prior. When I confronted her about it, holding that plastic band in my grease-stained hand, she went pale. "Oh, that," she stammered, her hand flying to her throat. I was visiting Cousin Reginald in the hospital. He didn't want visitors, so I didn't tell you." It sounded plausible. Reginald was sickly, but it felt wrong. The lies weren't loud. They were soft, practiced, almost gentle, like she was trying to protect me from something terrible. I stopped pushing. I figured if she was dying, she'd tell me when she was ready. I never imagined the secret wasn't about death, but about a life I didn't know existed. A week before the party, Lorraine came to my house alone. Denise was out again, another mysterious errand to the store that would take 3 hours. Lorraine sat across from me in my recliner, her hands shaking just a little in her lap. The TV was on low, some game show with flashing lights,
but neither of us was watching it. She looked at me for a long time, studying my face, like she was trying to memorize the lines and the gray hairs in my beard. "Daddy," she started, her voice barely a whisper, sounding smaller than I'd heard it since she was a child. "Daddy, promise you won't get mad at me." I chuckled, nervously, trying to lighten the mood, trying to pretend the air wasn't thick with tension. "Now, Lorraine, you know I can't promise something like that until I know what you did. Did you scratch my truck? Did you forget my birthday?" She didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. She leaned forward, her eyes intense and wet. "No, Daddy, it's serious. Whatever happens next week, promise you won't hate me." My stomach dropped like an elevator with a cut cable. "Hate you? Lorraine, you're my heart. I could never hate you. You're the best thing I ever did in this life." She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring round and round. "You say that now, but things change. People change when they get hurt." She stopped up, abruptly, wiping her face before it could crumble completely. "I have to go." And she left, without telling me a thing. I sat there in the quiet house, feeling a cold draft even though the windows were closed. I knew then that the storm wasn't just coming, it was already here, hovering right over my roof.
My retirement day arrived, sunny and bright, typical Mississippi weather for June. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, and the birds were singing like they didn't have a care in the world. I put on my best navy suit, the one Denise had bought me for our anniversary 5 years ago. I tied my tie, my fingers a little stiff with arthritis, and looked in the mirror. I saw a man who had worked hard, a man who was tired but ready to rest. I saw a man who thought he knew his life, who thought he had crossed the finish line. We drove to the hall in silence. Denise stared out the window the whole way, clutching her purse like it was a life preserver in a rough sea. When we got there, folks filled the room. There were streamers, balloons, and silver and gold, and big aluminum trays of pulled pork and potato salad. The pastor said a prayer, blessing my new chapter, and then the speeches started. My boss, Mr. Henderson, talked about how I could fix an engine by listening to it hum. My coworkers told stories about the nights we spent stranded on the side of the road, laughing over cold coffee and bad weather. Everyone laughed. The room was full of joy. Except Denise. She sat next to me, rigid as a board. She looked like she was waiting on a sentence from a judge. She didn't eat. She didn't drink. She just kept her eyes locked on the table in front of her, staring at the plastic tablecloth. I put my hand on her knee under the table to comfort her, just a gentle touch, and she flinched. She actually jumped. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. On a day that was supposed to be about celebrating our life together, she couldn't even stand my touch. Right before Lorraine walked to the microphone, she came over to our table. She stood there for a second, looking down at us, her shadow falling over the plates. She reached out and squeezed Denise's hand. It wasn't a gentle squeeze. It looked hard, forceful, like a warning. Denise pulled her hand away sharply, tucking it into her lap like she had been burned. She looked up at Lorraine with pleading eyes, shaking her head just a fraction of an inch. "Don't," she mouthed. I saw it. I saw the word form on her lips, silent and desperate. That small gesture told me more than words could. Denise was begging for silence. Lorraine looked angry, hurt, but mostly she looked determined. She had the look of a woman who had walked through fire to get to this moment and wasn't turning back no matter how much it burned. She took a deep breath, straightened her dress, turned her back on her mother, and walked toward the stage. I braced myself. I gripped the edges of my chair, my hand squeezing the cushions so hard I could feel the wood frame underneath. I didn't know what was coming. I thought maybe she was going to announce she was sick, or that she was getting divorced, or that Denise had cancer. My mind raced through every tragedy I could think of. I prepared myself for bad news. I steeled my heart for sorrow. I braced myself for anything, just not what came next. Nothing in my 72 years could have prepared me for the words that were about to come out of my daughter's mouth.
Lorraine began her speech normally enough. Her voice was steady, amplified by the speakers, filling the corners of the hall and bouncing off the back wall. She talked about my work ethic. "My daddy," she said, looking right at me, "is the hardest working man I've ever known. He taught me that you don't stop until the job is done." She talked about the nights I'd come home covered in grease, smelling like oil and exhaustion, but I'd still pick her up and spin her around until we were both dizzy. She talked about the sacrifices I made, the overtime, the missed holidays, so we could have a good Christmas. Then her voice broke. It cracked right down the middle, like a dry branch. She stopped speaking for a long moment, looking down at the wooden podium, gripping the sides of it. The room went quiet, sensing the shift. When she looked up again, there were tears streaming down her face. She looked directly at me, ignoring the 100 other people in the room, ignoring the balloons and the cake. "Daddy," she choked out, "you've given me everything. You've given me a name, a home, a life." She took a shuddering breath that echoed in the mic. "And because you've given me everything, you deserve the truth. You deserved it years ago." The room fell silent. You could hear a fly buzz on the other side of the hall. Folks stopped chewing. The air conditioning hummed, loud and intrusive. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at Denise. She had her face buried in her hands, her shoulders hunching forward. Lorraine continued, her voice gaining a little strength, but trembling with raw emotion. She said there was something I had never been told, something that had been kept from me for over 40 years. She said she herself had only learned it 2 months earlier. That explained the distance. That explained the anger. That explained the secret phone calls and the tears. "She found out by accident," Lorraine said into the microphone, her voice echoing. "And when I asked Mama about it, she denied it. She refused to admit it until I put the proof right in front of her face." The crowd murmured, a low ripple of confusion and shock moving through the room like a wave. I felt the eyes of my neighbors, my friends, boring into the back of my neck. I felt exposed, naked. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out right there in my chair, but I kept my face still. I didn't move. I sat there like a statue, frozen in time. I needed to hear it. I needed to know what was so terrible that my wife and daughter had been at war for months. Denise let out a sob, a ragged sound that tore through the quiet room. "Lorraine, please," she whimpered from beside me, her voice muffled by her hands. But Lorraine didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She had opened the door, and now we all had to walk through it.
Then she said it. She looked me dead in the eye, tears dripping off her chin onto the polished floor of the stage, and delivered the blow that cracked my world right down the middle. "Daddy, the truth is, you're not my biological father." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Half the room gasped. It was a sharp, collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the space. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I couldn't process the sentence. It was like she was speaking a language I didn't know. Not my daughter? But I held her when she was born. I cut the cord. I walked the floor with her when she had colic and screamed for 6 hours straight. I taught her to ride a bike. I paid for her college. I walked her down the aisle. Denise covered her mouth with both hands and started crying loudly now, a wail of pure misery before anyone else could speak. Her shoulders shook violently. The sound of her crying was the only thing that broke the spell of shock. I sat there and I felt something inside me simply turn off. The light in the room seemed to dim. The faces of my friends blurred into a watercolor mess. All I could see was Lorraine, standing on that stage, looking like she had just plunged a knife into her own chest to get the truth out. Lorraine kept going. She didn't step down. She had to finish it now that the truth was out. Her voice was shaking, but it was steady enough to be heard. She explained how she knew. She said she was helping Denise clean out the attic 2 months ago, looking for old quilts to donate, when she found a metal box tucked away under the insulation in the far corner. It was locked, but the lock was broken with rust. Inside, she found letters. Old letters yellowed with age, tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were from a man Denise knew before we were married, a man named Clifton. A man she'd seen again, briefly, just months before our wedding. A man she never told me about. Lorraine read the dates aloud. They matched the timeline of her conception perfectly. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable. The letters spoke of a brief fling, a mistake, a goodbye. But they also spoke of a child. Lorraine explained that she had taken a DNA test in secret, just to be sure, just to prove the letters were wrong. She wanted the letters to be a lie, but the test came back confirming it. I wasn't her father. This man, this Clifton, was. And Denise had known. She had known every single day for 42 years. Every time she watched me hold that baby, she knew. Every time I bragged about my girl, she knew. Then she said it. She looked me dead in the eye, tears dripping off her chin onto the polished floor of the stage, and delivered the blow that cracked my world right down the middle. Daddy, the truth is, you're not my biological father. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Half the room gasped. It was a sharp, collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the space. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I couldn't process the sentence. It was like she was speaking a language I didn't know. Not my daughter? But I held her when she was born. I cut the cord. I walked the floor with her when she had colic and screamed for 6 hours straight. I taught her to ride a bike. I paid for her college. I walked her down the aisle. Denise covered her mouth with both hands and started crying loudly now, a wail of pure misery before anyone else could speak. Her shoulders shook violently. The sound of her crying was the only thing that broke the spell of shock. I sat there and I felt something inside me simply turn off. The light in the room seemed to dim. The faces of my friends blurred into a watercolor mess. All I could see was Lorraine, standing on that stage, looking like she had just plunged a knife into her own chest to get the truth out. Lorraine kept going. She didn't step down. She had to finish it now that the truth was out. Her voice was shaking, but it was steady enough to be heard. She explained how she knew. She said she was helping Denise clean out the attic 2 months ago, looking for old quilts to donate, when she found a metal box tucked away under the insulation in the far corner. It was locked, but the lock was broken with rust. Inside, she found letters. Old letters yellowed with age, tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were from a man Denise knew before we were married, a man named Clifton. A man she'd seen again, briefly, just months before our wedding. A man she never told me about. Lorraine read the dates aloud. They matched the timeline of her conception perfectly. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable. The letters spoke of a brief fling, a mistake, a goodbye. But they also spoke of a child. Lorraine explained that she had taken a DNA test in secret, just to be sure, just to prove the letters were wrong. She wanted the letters to be a lie, but the test came back confirming it. I wasn't her father. This man, this Clifton, was. And Denise had known. She had known every single day for 42 years. Every time she watched me hold that baby, she knew. Every time I bragged about my girl, she knew.
The crowd didn't know what to do. It was agonizing. Some folks were staring at their plates, pretending to be fascinated by the potato salad. Others were staring at me with open pity, their mouths hanging open, their eyes wide. I could feel their embarrassment, their shock. This was supposed to be a party. This was supposed to be a celebration of a man's honest life. Instead, it was an execution of his dignity. It was a public shaming of everything I believed in. I stayed frozen, listening as Lorraine explained the rest. She told us that the man, Clifton, had passed away 5 years ago. But before he died, he had told his sister about a child he might have had in Hattiesburg. That sister had reached out to Lorraine through an attorney recently, prompting Lorraine to go looking in the attic in the first place. It was a perfect storm of secrets coming to light. Lorraine had a letter from him, written years ago, left for her in case she ever found out. She had shown it to Denise, and Denise, my wife of 50 years, had denied everything at first. She had lied to our daughter's face until the DNA test made it impossible to lie anymore. I felt sick, physically sick. The betrayal wasn't just the act itself. It was the decades of silence. It was the millions of moments we shared that were built on a foundation of sand. When Lorraine finally finished, she put the microphone down. It made a dull thud against the wood. She looked at me like she was apologizing for breaking me open, like she wanted to run down there and hug me, but she was afraid I would push her away. She looked small and scared again, just like she did when she was 5 years old and broke a vase in the hallway. Denise tried to stand beside me. She reached for my arm, her fingers trembling violently. "Carlton, please," she whispered, her voice wet with tears. "Let me explain." I stood up. My knees felt weak, like they were made of water, but I stood up. I stepped away from her touch without speaking. I couldn't bear the heat of her skin. I couldn't bear the smell of her perfume, the same scent she had worn for 50 years of lies. 50 years of marriage, 50 years of sleeping beside her, of praying with her, of trusting her with my life, and she had kept the very beginning of our family a lie. She had looked me in the face every day and let me believe a lie. It felt like my ribs had turned to glass and shattered inside my chest. Each breath was painful, sharp, and jagged. I looked at her. Really looked at her. And realized I didn't know the woman standing in front of me. The Denise I loved wouldn't do this. This was a stranger wearing her face.
People started to leave. They didn't say goodbye. They just grabbed their purses and hats and quietly slipped out the back doors, pretending not to stare, pretending they hadn't just witnessed a car crash. The room emptied out fast, leaving just the family and the wreckage of the party. The silence that followed was so thick you could almost touch it. I walked out to my truck. I didn't wait for Denise. She ran after me, her heels clicking on the pavement, stumbling a little. "Carlton, wait, please," she begged. I got in the truck and locked the door. She banged on the window, her face distorted by tears and makeup running down her cheeks. "I was young. I was scared," she screamed through the glass. "I didn't want to lose you." I drove home alone. The quiet in the cab was louder than any radio. Her words replayed over and over in my head. She didn't want to lose me, so she trapped me. She trapped me in a life that wasn't entirely true.
I got home and sat in the dark living room, staring at the pictures on the mantelpiece. Pictures of me and Lorraine. Pictures of the three of us. They all looked fake now. Lorraine came by the next morning. The sun was up, glaring bright and offensive against the windows, but the curtains in the house were drawn tight. I hadn't slept. I was sitting in my recliner, wearing the same rumpled clothes from the night before, staring at a blank wall. Lorraine used her key to let herself in. She stood in the doorway of the living room, her eyes puffy and swollen, looking like she hadn't slept either. She didn't come close. She stayed near the door, like she wasn't sure if she was welcome in the house anymore. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she said, crying softly. "I never meant to hurt you. I wanted honesty. I couldn't live with the lie anymore. It was eating me alive." I looked at her. I saw the daughter I raised. I saw the toddler I taught to walk. I saw the teenager I taught to drive. DNA or not, she was my girl. But looking at her hurt. It reminded me of everything I didn't know. It reminded me of Clifton. "I know, baby," I croaked, my voice sounding like gravel and rust. I took a deep breath that shuddered in my chest. "I need time. I can't do this right now. I need to breathe." She nodded, understanding. She wiped her face and turned to leave. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered. "I love you too," I said, and I meant it. But I didn't get up to hug her. I couldn't move.
Weeks passed. The retirement that was supposed to be a time of rest became a time of torment. Denise kept trying to apologize. She cooked my favorite meals: pot roast, collard greens, cornbread. I ate them in silence, the food tasting like ash in my mouth. She tried to talk to me in the evenings. "Carlton, I planned to take this to my grave," she said one night, sitting at the kitchen table while I washed dishes. "I did it because I loved you. I wanted us to be a family." "You did it for you, Denise," I said, not turning around, scrubbing a plate until I almost broke it. "You did it so you wouldn't have to face the consequences of what you did. You stole my choice." She cried then, putting her head on the table. She said the mistake was before our vows, that technically she hadn't cheated on me as a wife. But that didn't matter. A lie kept for a lifetime becomes part of the marriage. It weaves itself into the fabric of every day. Every birthday, every Christmas, every Father's Day card was tainted now. She had let me accept praise for being a good father to a child she knew wasn't mine. She had let me live in a fantasy. I told her I couldn't stay in the house. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I needed space to figure out who Carlton Hayes really was, if I wasn't the man I thought I was. I packed a bag. Just a few shirts, my shaving kit, and my worn-out Bible. I drove over to my brother Vernon's house on the other side of town. Vernon is a widower, lives alone in a small shotgun house near the creek where the frogs sing loud at night. He didn't ask questions when I showed up on his porch with a suitcase and a look of defeat on my face. He just opened the door and pointed to the spare room. I stayed there for a while, sleeping in a strange bed, smelling Vernon's old pipe tobacco instead of Denise's lavender potpourri. I spent my days sitting on Vernon's porch, rocking in a chair that squeaked, watching the cars go by and sorting through 50 years of memories. I tried to separate the truth from the lies. Was the happiness real? Yes. Was the love real? I thought so. But it was damaged. It was like a windshield with a crack running down the middle. You can still see through it, but the view is ruined. I didn't file for divorce. I couldn't bring myself to go down to the courthouse and sign papers to end a half-century. Not yet. But I didn't return home either. Denise called every day. Sometimes I answered, mostly I didn't. The truth had cracked everything open like an egg dropped on the floor. You can't just put the shell back together. I needed to know if I could live with the mess, or if I had to walk away from it entirely.
Over time, Lorraine and I started talking more. She would come over to Vernon's house, bring us lunch in styrofoam containers, and sit on the porch steps. We didn't talk about the DNA, or the letters, or Clifton. We talked about regular things. The weather, the price of gas, her job at the bank. We rebuilt the bridge between us slowly, plank by plank. One afternoon, she looked at me with those dark eyes and said, "Daddy, you know nothing changes for me, right? You're my father. Clifton was just a man. You're the one who put Band-Aids on my knees. You're the one who walked me down the aisle. You're the one who stayed." Her words helped. They were like a cool balm on a hot burn. Piece by piece, she stitched my heart back together. I realized that fatherhood isn't about biology, it's about presence. It's about showing up. I had shown up every single day. That man, whoever he was, he contributed the seed, but I grew the crop. I was the father. No test could take that away from me. But healing ain't quick work. It's slow, and it leaves scars. It's like a broken bone. It heals, but you can feel it ache when it rains. After 4 months of separation, living out of a suitcase, I agreed to meet Denise. Not at home, but at a counselor's office, a neutral ground. We sat in chairs that were too soft, facing a lady with a notepad that looked too young to understand 50 years of pain. It was awkward. It was painful. It was necessary. We talked for hours. For the first time, Denise really explained herself without the hysteria, without the panic. She talked about how young she was, barely 20, how scared she was of her own father's temper, of the judgment of the town. How much she loved me and was terrified that if I knew she was pregnant by another man, I would leave her behind. She talked about the shame she carried every day, the heaviness of the secret that sat on her chest like a brick. I listened. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fear that had lived inside her for 50 years. I saw the burden she had carried alone. I didn't forgive her that day. The hurt was still too fresh, the betrayal too deep. But I understood. I understood that good people can make terrible choices out of fear. And I understood that she had spent her whole life trying to make it up to me by being the best wife she could be. Understanding isn't the same as forgetting, but it's a start. It's a crack of light in a dark room.
Today, years later, things are different. Lorraine and I are closer than ever. We have an honesty between us now that is solid as rock. There are no more secrets. She calls me Daddy, and I call her my girl, and we both know exactly what that means. It means I chose her, and she chose me back. Denise and I found a quiet, careful peace. I moved back home eventually. It wasn't a romantic movie reunion with music swelling in the background. It was a decision. We decided that 50 years of shared history was worth saving, even if it was bruised. We're not the same couple we were. The innocence is gone, but we have something else now. Something honest. We talk more. We don't hide phones.
We don't keep secrets. We live in the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. If you're listening to this, let an old man tell you one thing. Truth delayed is still a storm waiting to break. Don't hide things from the people you love. It might seem easier today, but tomorrow it will cost you interest, and the debt is heavy. Thank you for sticking with me through this long story. Leave a like if this touched your heart, and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever been through something like this yourself, feel free to share it in the comments. Hearing your stories reminds this old man that he's not walking through this world alone. Take care of yourselves, and take care of the truth.